On August 23, 2020, at 7:30 a.m., paramedics responded to a call in Southfield, Michigan. 20-year-old Tamisha Beauchamp, a young woman with cerebral palsy, had stopped breathing. The paramedics attempted CPR, among other life-saving techniques, for 30 minutes, but it was too late. Tamisha was gone. Her body was transported to the James H. Cole Funeral Home, where an employee discovered that Tamisha's eyes were open and that she was once again breathing. She had spent 2 hours in a body bag. Unfortunately, Tamisha's harrowing tale is one that is surprisingly more common than you think. So common, in fact, that it has a name: the Lazarus phenomenon. This term is used to describe the mysterious circumstances that surround those who appear to be clinically dead, and then somehow spontaneously return back to life. I'm DreyOfTheDead, and it's time to feed your head. Throughout the centuries, one of people's greatest fears has been being accidentally buried alive. In the 1800s, the fear, known as taphophobia, was so prevalent that many people demanded post-mortem tests in their will, such as pouring hot liquid on their skin or making surgical incisions. Others were buried with crowbars or shovels. Some went to great lengths to avoid any chance of being buried alive, including Danish writer Hans Christian Andersen, who left a note on his nightstand each night that read, "I only appear to be dead," and requested his arteries to be slashed upon death. Polish composer Frédéric Chopin demanded that his heart be removed after death and buried in Poland. This mass hysteria eventually led to the invention of safety coffins with breathing tubes, flags, and bells that would notify others when the buried were indeed alive. As far back as the 5th century, history is littered with reports of premature death declarations and burials. In 1896, T.M. Montgomery, supervisor of exhumation at the Fort Randall Cemetery, reported, quote, "Nearly 2% of those exhumed were no doubt victims of suspended animation due to signs of attempted escape from within the coffin." With the prevalence of diseases such as cholera and smallpox, and the limited medical knowledge regarding comas and stupors, methods of determining death were rudimentary at best. Here are some grave examples. According to 11th and 12th century Byzantine Greek historians, Eastern Roman Emperor Flavius Zeno died in April of 491 AD after ruling for 17 years. His passing was thought to be the result of excessive drinking or an illness. But while in his sarcophagus, he awoke and was heard shouting, "Have pity on me!" for 3 full days. But because he was so hated by his wife and subjects, they refused to open his tomb. In 1705, Marjorie Mccall of Lurgan, Ireland, became very ill and tragically passed on. The funeral was abuzz with talk of the valuable ring still on her finger. You see, it was common in the 1700s for grave robbers to steal from the dead. Knowing this, her husband attempted to remove the ring, but Marjorie's fingers had swelled since her fever. That night, as suspected, her grave was unearthed by looters. Unable to remove the ring from her finger, they pulled a knife to cut it from her hand. As first blood was drawn, Marjorie suddenly sat up, giving the robbers such a scare that they fled the scene. She returned home and went on to live a full life, giving birth to several children. Alice Blunden of Basingstoke, England, was known for her excessive drinking. One day in 1674, She consumed a large amount of poppy water and fell into a deep sleep from which she could not be wakened. Upon consulting with an apothecary, Alice was declared dead. Her husband had urgent business in London and requested that she not be buried until his return. Citing the hot weather at the time and Alice's large size, her family decided it would be impossible to keep her fresh and had her buried immediately. Days later, a few boys who were playing nearby heard a voice from beneath the grave. When it was opened, her body was found severely beaten, likely from an attempt to escape. With no detectable signs of life, they lowered her back into the grave and awaited the coroner's deliberation the next day. Upon their return, they found the sheets further shredded and her mouth torn apart. She'd been prematurely buried not once, but twice. Though several people were tried for neglect in the case of Alice Blunden, none were convicted. In 1937, 19-year-old Angel Hayes of France suffered a terrible motorcycle accident that claimed his life and left him so disfigured, his parents weren't allowed to view his body. He was subsequently placed in a morgue and buried 3 days later. When an investigating insurance company requested his body be exhumed for evidence 2 days later, they found Angel still warm with no signs of decomposition. As it turned out, he had fallen into a deep coma that significantly reduced his need for oxygen. After several surgeries and a long rehabilitation, his health was restored, and he became somewhat of a celebrity. In the 1970s, he created a coffin designed to house victims of premature burial long enough to be rescued. It featured an alarm system, a toilet, a food compartment, and even a small library. Though the Lazarus phenomenon is considered a rare occurrence, many medical officials believe it to be significantly underreported due to the embarrassing professional and legal ramifications involved. Causes remain mostly unknown to this day, with a few plausible explanations pointing to a delayed return of spontaneous circulation and apnea. As it stands, about half of those who wake after being declared dead die shortly thereafter, and not all cases take place 6 feet under. Having survived his own burial, Dr. William Tebb compiled 219 instances of narrow escape from live burial, 149 cases of actual premature burial, 10 cases in which bodies were accidentally dissected before death, and 2 cases in which embalming began on the living. A 2013 study found that nearly half of all French emergency room physicians claimed to have witnessed a case of autoresuscitation during their career. In Oxford, England in 1650, 22-year-old Anne Greene experienced an unfortunate miscarriage. Because the child was illegitimate, she attempted to hide the remains, but was caught and charged with murder. To expedite her hanging, she requested that her friends pull at her body, and was even hit a number of times by the butt of a soldier's musket. After half an hour, she was cut down and sent to Oxford University for their anatomy class dissection. But when they opened the coffin the next day, they found that she was breathing and had a faint pulse. After physicians made numerous attempts to revive her, she slowly recovered and was granted a pardon. She went on to marry and have 3 children. Matthew Wall of Braffin, England, was a young farmer who had everything ahead of him, including marriage to his longtime sweetheart. But in October of 1571, his life tragically ended. At his funeral, one of the pallbearers carrying his coffin down Fleece Lane lost his footing in the damp autumn leaves, and to everyone's horror, the coffin fell to the ground. The shock further escalated when a loud knocking and yelling was heard coming from inside the casket. As it turned out, Matthew was very much still alive. The young man went on to marry his sweetheart and fathered 2 sons. Before his death in 1595, he requested in his will that the town celebrate his narrow escape by ringing the church bells every 2nd of October. To this day, the residents of Braffen celebrate Old Man's Day each year by tolling the church bells, watching the children sweep away the autumn leaves of Fleece Lane, and singing songs over his grave. Italian Cardinal Somaglia grew very ill and fell unconscious in 1830. Thought to be dead, the embalming process was started immediately to prep him for the family vault. Upon cutting into his chest, the surgeon found that his heart was still beating. Just then, the cardinal awoke and pushed the knife away, but it was too late. His lung had been punctured in the process, and he died on the table as a result of his injuries. In 1993, 24-year-old Sipho Mletshe of Johannesburg, South Africa, was declared dead following a traffic accident. His fiancée, who was also in the crash, survived with minor injuries. Spending the next 2 days in a metal box in the morgue, Sipho drifted in and out of consciousness until he finally realized where he was and called out for help. Upon being freed, he attempted to reach his fiancée, who refused to believe his story. Sipho was heartbroken to learn that she believed him to be a zombie back from the dead to haunt her. If you enjoyed this strange but true tale, be sure to subscribe to my channel. There's a new Feed Your Head episode every week. If you'd like to support the future of these videos, consider joining my Patreon, where you can access exclusive blooper reels, behind-the-scenes footage, and take part in my creative process. As always, thank you for watching, be well, and stay strange.